Hello everybody and welcome back to the Web Dev Coach, where my goal is to teach you web development. In this video, we're going to continue on with creating the FreeCodeCamp curriculum's random quote machine. And in this video, we'll actually get to display a random quote on the screen. If you missed my last two videos, in my first video, I just broke the project down, broke down what our approach would be, and installed Create React app onto our local machine and started a new React application in a text editor on our local machine. So we're not using CodePen here. We're not using any online IDE. We're using a text editor on our local laptop or computer. In the last video, we created a button component, which was just a custom wrapper around an HTML element. So if you want, please go back to those videos, take a look, and get all caught up. The next steps in the random quote machine will be to import quote data into our component. This will be a list of quotes, an array of quotes. Each individual quote will be an object. It will be an object with two properties, an author property and a text property. The text will be the quote, and the author will be the person who wrote that quote. We'll have the ability to randomly select a quote when we click the button. So when we click the button, we randomly select the quote, and that quote is displayed on the screen. I broke down our application here on the right. The outer box, the parent, is our app component, and the app component will be responsible for holding the data in its state. It'll get some quote data, and it'll have a selected quote index. That'll be a number from 0 to the length of the array, -1 basically. And when we combine the two, we get a selected quote. So if we have a quote data of length 3 and we say get me quote number 2, we'll have that selected quote, and we'll be able to pass that as a prop into our quote machine. We also will need a method called, let's just call it select new random index, and that'll select a random index from the quote data array. And we can also pass that method into the quote machine component. From the quote machine component, we'll pass that method into our button component, and that there, when we pass a prop from one component to another component and to another component, is called prop drilling. We're drilling down a prop into a few components until it reaches its destination component. So we'll be using prop drilling here to drill the select new random index method as a click handler to the button component. And the button will be able to click it, select a new random index in our app component, which will pass down a new selected quote to our quote machine component and render it out. I know that was a lot of information, but with the magic of YouTube, you could luckily rewind this, rewatch what I just said, and hopefully understand what we're doing in the next few minutes when we get to some code. Also, when we do get some code, this will all become a lot clearer, and I'll be revisiting this picture to make sure we're right on track. Lastly, I do want to implore you to take the time before every project to draw out pictures like this and make sure you have a big picture understanding of what you want to accomplish, because when you get into some coding, you are very focused. You're in the code, and it's hard to see the big picture. So prior to coding, I do implore that you write out what you want to accomplish, draw pictures so you could see the big picture of the app component of the application, and have it next to you as you code. Anywho, let's get on to some code. Here we are back at our code where we left off. We created a click handler that only console logs hi at the moment, and we passed that click handler over to a button, and that button, when pressed, calls the click handler that is passed to it in props. If you missed any of that, please go to my last video where we cover all of that. Now, the next step is to actually initialize state for the app component. And state will be where we hold the actual array of quotes. And B is to actually get the array of quotes into our application. Now, you may be thinking I could create a new file that is an array of quote objects. That would be one way, and I could import it into our application and everything would be fine. But another way is to actually, whoop, going the wrong place. Another way would be actually to find these list of random quotes on the internet. I googled random quote gist, and if you don't know what gist is, they're just basically little code snippets. I clicked the second one here, and that actually brings up a list of random quotes in JSON format. Now, JSON format is exactly what we want. You'll see that it starts off with a square bracket, and they are objects of quotes. There's a quote, which is the actual quote, and the author, the person who wrote it. Now, there are a ton of quotes here, so we're all set. Now, I won't be able to fetch from this website here, but I will be able to fetch from the raw JSON. You'll see that the address changes to an actual JSON, and we'll be able to get to it. You'll see that my JSON is very pretty. I use a Google extension called JSONView. I'll be linking to that in the description in the video, so no worries about getting that extension. But again, it's called JSONView. It's great. So we're going to copy this address here just to have on our clipboard ready to go. Back at our code, as I said, let's initialize our state. Our state is initialized in the constructor of the class, and before we do anything, we actually have to call the super constructor with passing props into it. After that, we initialize our state, and our states will have a quotes array. Right now, that's an empty array. And if you remember from the pre-planning phase, we'll actually have a selected quote index. Right now, that'll be null, but soon that'll be the index of where the selected quote lives and the quote that is rendered onto the screen. Great. Now let's actually try fetching our, getting our JSON data. And spoiler alert, we will be using a browser API called fetch. What fetch does, it sends a GET request to a website of our choice and gets data from that website. The website of our choice will be this web page, I should say. We'll be getting the data from this web page. We'll be getting the data from this quotes.json web page. So the best life cycle method that React has to actually fetch data is called component did mount here. And this lifecycle method is called after a React component is mounted. So it'll be called after React component is mounted. That way it's safe to fetch new data. So the way we use the fetch method is by typing in fetch and the URL of the website. And the web page, again, was on my clipboard. And that returns a promise. So we can chain then functions or then callbacks. Not really callbacks. I could say we chain thens into them, and the first parameter of a then is a function that is called after that promise, the initial promise of fetching this website is resolved. So again, it goes, fetches it, it promises it'll do it, and then after we do that, we take that data and we actually parse it for the actual JSON data. We go through the response, we rip out the body, and then we rip out the JSON. And that's what this JSON function is doing. It's going into the body and parsing the JSON for us. After parsing that JSON, we have actual good data. And just to prove it, I actually just want to console log out that data for you, just so you can get an idea of what it actually looks like. So let's inspect this application, and that's right here. And remember that I console logged out what we got from the fetch, and you'll see here an actual list of quotes in our console. So again, what did this for us is this little snippet of code. We fetched the data from the web page, we parsed it for its JSON, and then we got the actual quote data. So we want to take, you know what, let's call it quotes. And we want to take those quotes and set it to our state. So we'll call this dot set state, and we'll pass in an object called quotes. We could do it like this. However, with ES6, we don't have to write it 2 times. We can just write it once, and it'll ES6 will know enough to apply the quotes parameter here to the quotes key of our set state object. So again, this is actually equal to this, and the reason it's equal is because the names are exactly the same. Now that we fetched our quotes from the gist and set our state, let's do a quick sanity check to make sure the quotes are actually landing in our state safe and sound. The way we do this is by just console logging out in the render function this.state.quotes. Remember, whenever state changes, the render function is rerun. So basically, it should rerun after it sets the state here. So let's go back to our React app. Let's open up our console. And yep, here you are. You'll see that our array of quotes is in our state. It's logged out here. Great. The next step is to initialize our selected quote index to a randomly selected index inside that array of quotes. So let's actually create a select quote, select quote index will be our method name, and let's actually install a library called Lodash, and this library will have a method in there that actually returns a random number between 0 and whatever else I give it. And this, as you'll see in the documentation, this random function is exactly what I want. It produces a random number between a lower and upper bounds. Why am I using Lodash instead of writing my very own? Well, why do that? Lodash is tried, it's tested, it's true, and I think it's just cool to learn about new libraries, and this is my way of showing you the magic of Lodash. There are a number of other functions here that are super helpful when working with arrays and working with objects. But anywho, the one that I want is Lodash random, so I will actually import, as it's installing, import random from Lodash. Right, and from this function, I'll return a random integer from 0 to the length -1 of the quotes array. So the first parameter is 0, the second parameter is length -1 of the quotes array. If there is no length, if there is no length, we're just going to return, that'll return undefined. And that's really it there. That should return a random index, and we'll set that to our selected quote index. And where we do that is here in the callback method of set state. So after the quotes state is set, we have access to that only in the callback method. We cannot write it here. For instance, let me go back. We can't get quotes here because setState is an asynchronous function. This .state.quotes is not set synchronously. What that means is this will run first as it goes off and fetches that data. This line 19 would run, and quote still would be our empty array instead of what we expected to be if it was synchronous. So let's not run it on line 19. Instead, we'll use the callback function in the this.setState function, and we'll set the state of our selected quote index to selected quote index method call. And that should actually be this dot selected quote index, just like that. I can spot another gotcha straight from the get-go. Select quote index is, let me fix that, actually using this. Now in React, when we use this, we actually need to bind this in the constructor. It's a little tedious, and the way we do that is this.select quote index equals this.select quote index dot bind this in the constructor, and that's for every single method in React that uses this. There are other ways around this by using some ES7 syntax, but for now let's stick to this, and in future videos hopefully I'll be able to show you the ES7 syntax. That is a way around of binding this every single time. So now we have a a selected index that is a random number between 0 and the length of the array, -1. So again, let's do a sanity check and make sure that our this.state selected quote index is actually being initialized to some random number. So let's go back to our app. Let's look at our console. It's null, then it's null again, and then it can't. Oh, I made a mistake. This here should be this.state.quotes. I don't know where I got this.quote from. It should be this. If this.state.quotes doesn't have a length, then just return. Let's try once again. And again, I like to record my errors because that's just something that happens during coding. It's quite natural, and it shouldn't look like I am perfect. And I did the same thing here. This.quotes.length. It should be this.state.quotes.length. Let's try. Third time is a charm. Okay, so you'll see here that we have a random number of 14. If we refresh the application, we should get another random number between 1 and 0 and I think 102. And you'll see that we have 2. So we are initializing our selected quote index in state just as we wanted to. Nice job. What we have in our state right now is an array of quotes and an index where our selected quote lives. What we want to do is actually render out that selected quote here in our render function. We can write all the logic in the render function, but that'll be pretty ugly, and that's not exactly where logic belongs. Remember, we need to actually check if the state is initialized, if we received the quotes, and then if we did receive the quotes, we want to render out the selected index, the quote at the selected index, but only if the selected quote index is initialized. So all that conditional logic does not belong in the render. That gets really ugly really quick. And this function that we're going to write will be getting something for us. So let's use the ES6 get syntax. So we'll write a getter function by starting out with get, and we'll get the selected quote. However, if this dot state dot quotes has no length, if it has a length of 0, or let's see, if the so number has an isInteger function that actually returns false if the parameter is not an integer. So if this .state.selected quote index is not an integer, we're just going to go ahead and return undefined, right? But if we don't return undefined, we can actually return, let's see, expected to return a value. Okay, so if we don't return undefined, we can return this .state .quotes at this .state .selected quote index. So we will return that out there. Now, if let's see, down here, if we actually get something from this .selected quote, I notice that I'm calling this .selected quote as if it were a variable. It's actually a function, but when we use the get syntax, we can call it as if it were a regular variable. That's why I love the get syntax. It's clean, and it's really powerful, and we can just call it again just really simply. So if that selected quote is not undefined, right? So if it exists, here I'm using a ternary operator. Let's render out this dot selected quote dot quote, and if else, let's render out nothing. So let's see if what I wrote here actually makes sense. Let's see if it works. So we'll wait for our React app to load and see what errors I get this time. As you see, the quote actually does show up here after a while, after it does its fetch request, and all we have here is the quote. There are no quotation marks, and there's actually no author. So to fix that, I'm going to actually use template syntax to render out the quote, and inside the template syntax, I'll put quotation marks around the quote, and here I'll again use template syntax to render out our author. Perfect. So again, this is what the template syntax looks like, just like that, and that way we could interpolate some strings with the values of inside our selected quote. So let's take a look. Here we are, we have a quote. Winning isn't everything, but wanting to win is. So again, this is a random quote, randomly fetched, and randomly initialized here. What we didn't do this video is actually give the button any power to select a new quote index. So that's something we'll actually have to do next video, given time constraints, and I really do apologize for not being able to get to it in this video. However, we did do a lot. In this video, we fetched a bunch of JSON. We set that JSON to our app's state, and after fetching that JSON, we actually randomly initialized a index in that array. And after all that, we were able to render the quote and author onto our screen. We're pretty much 60 or 70% of the way there. We're rendering quotes on the screen, and that's pretty much, I think, 70% of the battle. So we're almost at the home stretch. I see this going on for about 2 more videos. Hopefully we can get this done, and I plan for some extra credit where we may use some newer tools to do some cool stuff. But until then, please hit the subscribe button if you like this video. Please hit the like button if you like this video. If you have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, I would love to hear it in the comment section. Until next time, this is the Web Dev Coach signing off. Have a great day.